My name is Stanton Hudson. I'm the executive director of the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site here in Buffalo, New York, and here tonight to celebrate Black History Month on a topic of real interest to us here in Buffalo. We look forward to the program tonight, Tempest in a Teapot, when Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington dined at the White House. It was right here in this building on September 14th of 1901, after being sworn in as President of the United States, that TR wrote a letter to Booker T. Washington, the principal of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. With this letter, Roosevelt set in motion an unintended controversy that would become a tempest in a teapot, inspire a national conversation on race relations, and shape the relationship between Washington and TR. Michelle Krowl is the Civil War and Reconstruction Specialist in the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress. She received a BA in History from the University of California, Riverside, and an MA and Ph.D. in History from the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of several articles and books on topics relating to the Civil War, as well as Quantico, Virginia, and the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. She's worked as a library assistant at the Historical Society in Washington, D.C., as an assistant professor at Northern Virginia Community College, and as a research assistant for historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. Michelle delivered a slightly modified version of Tempest in a Teapot here in Buffalo, New York on October 16th of 2022 during the 103rd annual meeting of the Theodore Roosevelt Association on the 121st anniversary of the TR Booker T. Washington White House dinner. Welcome, Michelle. We now turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Stanton. First of all, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, not hearing anything. And thank you again for inviting me back. It was such a pleasure to be at the site in 2022 and really get to explore the museum. You have a wonderful site, so I really enjoyed my time there. Okay, let me share my screen. So hopefully you're now seeing the PowerPoint. And if nothing comes up in the chat or if I don't hear anything, I will assume we're all good.
Looks good.
Okay, terrific. Thanks. So as Stanton said, on September 14th, 1901, in the library of Buffalo lawyer Ansley Wilcox's home on Delaware Street, or Delaware Avenue, which is now the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site where some of you are currently sitting, Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as the 26th President of the United States, following the death of William McKinley from an assassin's bullet. Despite the significance of the day for TR, and no doubt many other details to attend to as the new executive, TR wrote this letter to Booker T. Washington, the notable African-American principal of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. The two had been planning for TR to visit Tuskegee, but McKinley's assassination and TR's elevation to the presidency upended the schedule. Instead, TR asked Washington when he would next come north and expressed urgency to see Washington to discuss not educational matters, but rather political appointments in the South. With this letter, Theodore Roosevelt set in motion an unintended controversy that just over a month later would prove a temporary tempest in a teapot, inspire a national conversation on race relations, and contour the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington. Politics often makes strange bedfellows, and at first glance, Washington and Roosevelt would seem to have little in common, professionally or personally. An African-American educator who literally had to elevate himself up from slavery as the title of his 1901 autobiography stated, Booker T. Washington, who was born in 1856, spent his life navigating the segregated South to promote his doctrine of self-help and economic independence as the key to Black success. He learned this lesson at the Hampton Institute in Virginia just after the Civil War and founded his own Tuskegee Institute on these principles. In 1895, the same year that abolitionist Frederick Douglass died, Booker T. Washington achieved national fame with a speech at the Atlanta Exposition, a speech which has also been called the Atlanta Compromise for its accommodationist message. The speech addressed white Americans' fears by reassuring them that Black success would not necessarily lead to racial integration. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, he promised, yet as one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. With this conciliatory speech and his work at Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington became one of the most prominent African Americans in the nation and someone looked to by white business and political leaders as an advisor on race relations. Theodore Roosevelt, by contrast, was born in 1858 into a wealthy and well-connected family in New York City. Surrounded by loving parents and siblings, he never wanted for anything in his youth, except for perhaps robust health. He was allowed to explore his intellectual curiosity, enjoyed educational opportunities in the U.S. and abroad, and few doors were ever closed to him. Despite the death of his beloved father when TR was in college, TR had a golden future there for the taking. You might say that TR only had to elevate himself up from Manhattan. But despite these vastly different backgrounds, Washington and Roosevelt shared some goals and values that brought them together in mutual respect. Both firmly believed in self-help and providing opportunities for talented individuals to succeed. Washington's whole life was a testimony to that, whereas TR had to make his own body to overcome his poor health and asthma as a child. He pushed himself to succeed as a rancher in the Badlands, and in the political arena, few men of his social class ever entered. But most importantly, both sought to influence the political landscape of the South to mitigate the dominance of Southern Democrats who hindered Black rights, and in TR's case, perhaps to secure Republicans previously loyal to political boss Mark Hanna. They hoped to install in patronage positions worthy individuals who could do the job honestly and with a measure of fairness to African Americans, too often shut out of the Jim Crow South. Within weeks of TR's assumption of the presidency, the two had already conferred on several potential appointments, including an Alabama judicial position. Washington recommended former Governor Thomas G. Jones, who, despite being a former Confederate and white Democrat, was, in Washington's estimation, he far surpassed any other likely candidate. Washington informed TR that Jones had, quote, stood up in the Constitutional Convention and elsewhere for a fair election law, opposed lynching, and has been outspoken for the education of both races. Roosevelt appointed Jones to the position on the strength of Washington's recommendation. This example aligns with the observation by Washington's biographer, Louis R. Harlan, that both TR and Washington, quote, were pragmatists willing to sacrifice mere principles for the sake of power, and yet each had a strong sense of personal mission. Each spoke and thought of his work in terms of high moral purpose, but when the occasion called for ruthless action, could decide and act in his own interest, unquote. So if a white Southern Democrat in a federal position could better advance their agenda than a Black Southern Republican, then so be it. A little over a month after TR became president, he asked to meet with him as soon as possible. Booker T. Washington was once again in the nation's capital. On October 16, 1901, TR sent a note to Washington, who was stopping with his friend Whitefield McKinley, inviting him to dinner at the White House. "My dear Mr. President," Washington replied, "I shall be very glad to accept your invitation for dinner this evening at 7:30. Despite how famous, or in some cases infamous, this dinner soon became, it is actually really challenging to recreate the details. Roosevelt and Washington attended, obviously, as did Colorado businessman Philip B. Stewart. Edith Roosevelt was certainly part of the dinner party as well. Some accounts claim that several of the Roosevelt children dined with the group, although as of yet I have not seen a primary source to document this reliably. Ted was attending Groton at the time, so his presence is doubtful. Some authors put 17-year-old Alice at the table too. I tend to doubt this, as evidence suggests that she'd been spending the summer in Connecticut with TR's sister, Anna Roosevelt Cowles. Edith Roosevelt may have thought it was better for the unpredictable Alice to stay with Auntie Bai and other relatives until the rest of the family settled in at the White House. Furthermore, Alice claimed in her autobiography that the first time that she saw her father after he became president was when he visited New Haven, Connecticut, to receive an honorary degree from Yale later in October 1901. Given Alice's love of the unconventional, one suspects that had she actually been there, she would have relished commenting on an infamous White House dinner that caused so much controversy. In addition to not being able to easily document everyone who sat around the table, I cannot tell you what was on the menu or exactly what was discussed beyond federal appointments in the South. At the end of the dinner, Booker T. Washington returned to Whitefield McKinley's home before leaving on a late-night train for New York. None of the attendees apparently thought something revolutionary had occurred, although Washington clearly understood the significance of his dining with the president at the White House. But an Associated Press reporter on the White House beat took a look at the guest list at the end of the night and spied Washington's name. The following day, October 17th, newspapers began picking up variations of the story that Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee, Alabama, dined with the president last evening. By October 18th, a firestorm of controversy had been lit in the press, which quickly turned into a conflagration. Somewhat predictably, the tone of the reporting and the editorial comment varied greatly based on the region of the country and the racial composition of the audience. Over the next couple of weeks, hundreds of articles, opinion pieces, and letters to the editors appeared in newspapers around the United States and internationally. From metropolitan dailies to small-town newspapers, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Even just perusing the personal scrapbooks in the Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington papers at the Library of Congress provides a flavor of press coverage on the incident and its interpretations. With a few exceptions, from the white press in the South came mainly bitter denunciations of President Roosevelt, Booker T. Washington, or both, for crossing the color line socially. Perhaps not surprisingly, the most exercised white Southerners engaged in what one historian called a, quote, orgy of hysteria. The Memphis Scimitar characterized TR's dinner invitation as, quote, the most damnable outrage which has ever been perpetrated by any citizen of the United States, unquote. Some white Southerners predicted that this one dinner signaled social equality for the races, with miscegenation being the inevitable result. In a letter to the editor of the Jacksonville, Florida metropolis, E.Y. Harvey prophesied just such an outcome. Quote, eating at the same table means social equality. Social equality means free right of intermarriage, and intermarriage means the degradation of the white race. When the white race yields social equality with the Negro, it has defied the laws of God, and he will sweep them from the earth, unquote. So from appetizers to Armageddon, all in one dinner. Although these same individuals never seem to acknowledge the varying shades of skin color already all around them, in large part a legacy of the sexual exploitation of African American women, to which whites typically turned a blind eye during slavery and the Jim Crow eras. Race baiters further claimed that the social equality suggested by the dinner would upend the racial order of the South, requiring violence to restore. White supremacist Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman of South Carolina was reported to have said that, quote, the action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that N-word will necessitate our killing 1,000 N-words in the South before they will learn their place again, unquote. And I'm sure everybody understands that Ben Tillman did not say N-word, he actually said the word. On the whole, press coverage in the North and West tended to take a much more moderate view on the dinner, suggesting it was President Roosevelt's business who he invited to dinner, and doubting that the country would go to hell in a handbasket because Booker T. Washington dined at the White House. It requires no advocacy of social equality or intimacy between the two races to defend and even warmly commend President Roosevelt for receiving Booker Washington, the Minneapolis Journal stated. A few publications focus less on the broken color line than the individual TR invited. The Western Laborer of Omaha, Nebraska, for example, believed that, quote, the president's table was as much honored by Mr. Washington's presence as he was honored by the invitation thereto, unquote, given Washington's extraordinary achievements. The Detroit Free Press asserted that TR was, quote, not the kind of man to be terrified by anybody's notions of the social obligations of a president. When the president invited Booker T. Washington to dinner, the Free Press commented, it is improbable that he had the slightest suspicion of the hornet's nest that he was about to pull down upon his head. But if he had, it would not have made the slightest difference in his conduct. The president invited Mr. Washington to dinner, not because Washington is a Negro, but because he is Booker T. Washington. Outside the South, the focus of quite a few newspaper articles and editorials was less on the dinner itself than on the extreme reaction of white Southerners to Roosevelt's perceived insult in inviting any African American to dine, and even hinting at social equality of the races. The October 19, 1901 issue of the Minneapolis Journal included an article bearing the title, Race Prejudice Becomes Monomania. After characterizing racial segregation in formal and official social functions to be, quote, a national disgrace, unquote, that needed to be confronted, the journal responded to some of the more extreme newspaper coverage that it was, quote, not short of proof of monomania for persons or papers to become violently agitated because Mr. Roosevelt chooses to sit down to dinner with the South's most prominent educator. Thus, the dinner in some ways became a proxy for a larger discussion in the press about race in America. Artists applied their pens to the controversy as well. Elias Jones of Baltimore, Maryland, sent this cartoon to Roosevelt's secretary, George B. Cortelyou, as an example of the political propaganda used in an October 1901 election by the quote-unquote contemptible Democrats to swing the results in their favor. Not only did this illustration remind white voters that TR's dinner with Booker T. Washington crossed racial boundaries, but it also put Edith Roosevelt literally in the center, emphasizing the violation of the gender line with her participation in the meal. Artist Carter Simons of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle captured the sentiment of other Americans about the Roosevelt-Washington dinner, that it was a controversy ginned up by rubberneckers like the Solid Old South, Antebellum Spirit, and Gossip, who failed to heed the sentiment on the wall plaque behind, blessed be those who mind their own business. The cartoon accompanied, there we go. The cartoon accompanied the original Associated Press report in a contemporary political handbill, which asked, why should not the colored man vote the Republican ticket? According to the handwritten annotation, these handbills were distributed in Roanoke, Virginia on October 19, 1901. Like the press coverage, correspondence received by Booker T. Washington and Theodore Roosevelt also ran the gamut, with individuals expressing both positive and negative opinions about the dinner. And its significance. Washington's secretary claimed that Booker T. Washington received, quote, enough threatening letters to fill a desk drawer, leading to an increased security presence around his home at Tuskegee. Some writers thought Washington had shown poor judgment in accepting Roosevelt's invitation. A New Orleanian told Washington the dinner had been a mistake, quote, and that you, in a momentary loss of your remarkable level-headedness and good judgment, had, unwittingly, been a party to the setting back and undoing of your untiring good work for years past. A writer from Brooklyn proclaimed, quote, your actions have ruined Mr. Roosevelt in the South. He has probably lost his career by it. All the work of our late president to take the, quote, seam out of the flag is undone by one selfish action, a great mistake. Quote, don't accept all the invitations you receive is my motto, unquote, entirely. Washington's personal papers at the Library of Congress contained far more letters of praise and encouragement. Washington Secretary Emmett J. Scott initially congratulated his boss on the event. It is splendid, magnificent. The world is moving forward, and I hope they will find it out sometime soon. My heart bubbles over, and I am so glad. Banker W.R. Pettifor believed that, quote, the discussion of this matter relative to the conduct of the president inviting you to dinner will cause both North and South to look deeper into the merits of the Negro for equal justice than anything that has happened lately. And in a fit of exuberance, one woman told Washington that she had, quote, so thoroughly enjoyed the White House Tempest that I am prepared to throw up my very best hat and hurrah for Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt's correspondence also contained a mixture of scorn and praise. Perhaps encouraged by the medium of a telegram, R.J. Belzer of Georgia got right to the point. You have made mistake. He who dines with Negro, we think no better. To compel his wife is worse. A New York Magazine editor countered, quote, of course you will not be influenced in the least by the hubbub and exhibition of ill breeding that is going on in the South. I am glad you invited Booker Washington to the White House. It was a wholesome thing to do. The whole nation outside the South will sustain you. Lawyer and novelist Albion Turget wrote an extraordinary letter from France where he served as the U.S. consulate in Bordeaux. Having observed American race relations for decades and served as the lead attorney for Black plaintiff Homer Plessy in the 1896 landmark U.S. Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, Turget despaired of the denunciations of TR he read in the newspapers, which changed his mind that education and Christian values might bring about a change in racial thought. Among his words of praise for TR's actions, Turget wrote, I thank you, I congratulate you, I pity you. It is the bravest thing ever done by an American. In responding to Turget, TR claimed no credit for himself. Quote, when I asked Booker T. Washington to dinner, I did not devote very much thought to the matter one way or the other. I respect him greatly and believe in the work he has done. I have consulted so much with him, it seemed to me that it was natural to ask him to dinner to talk over this work. And the very fact that I felt a moment's qualm on inviting him because of his color made me ashamed of myself and made me hasten to send the invitation. In an address delivered on October 27, 1901, African-American clergyman Francis J. Grimke delved into what was at the center of the, quote, hue and cry in the South over the episode, race, pure and simple. Quote, Booker T. Washington has always been the ideal Negro in the eyes of the Southern whites, Grimke argued. If he had belonged to any other race under the sun, it would have made no difference. It is because of his color that these fools are uttering their impotent rage. Still, Grimke thought much good had come from the dinner incident, including riling up an apathetic North and showing the South's true colors with regard to African Americans. After years of white Americans believing that the South knew best how to handle race relations, the dinner, quote, has brought out in a clearer light than anything which has ever happened before the real feeling of the South towards the Negro, Grimke stated. The Negro can never be anything but an inferior. That is what the South believes. That is what it has been teaching. That is what this howl that has been going up about the entertainment of Professor Washington means. Grimke was likely disappointed in his hopes that Northerners would strike a blow for equality, but reaction to the dinner did clarify the racial opinions of many white Southerners. And what about the two principals at the dinner? What did Booker T. Washington and Theodore Roosevelt have to say about the incident? Well, neither actually commented publicly at the time about the dinner, which prompted praise from some quarters, but they did share their thoughts in private correspondence. Washington wrote to TR on October 26th, providing his assessment of the incident. I have refrained from writing you regarding the now famous dinner, which both of us ate so innocently, until I could get into the South and study the situation at first hand. I believe that a great deal is being made over the incident because of the elections which are now pending in several of the Southern states. I do not believe that the matter is felt as seriously as the newspapers try to make it appear. A few days later, on October 31st, Washington wrote again, confessing that, quote, the outbreak over my dining with you was far beyond my expectations. I cannot help but feel that it was providential and that good is going to come out of it. Theodore Roosevelt's outgoing correspondence records that TR's initial response to the controversy was a mix of surprise, chagrin, and defiance. And you'll see some kind of themes that go through what he says to other people. To Joseph B. Bishop, he confessed feeling, quote, melancholy for the South at the way the Southerners have behaved in this matter. To Congressman Lucius Littauer, TR explained, I had no thought whatever of anything save of having a chance of showing some little respect to a man whom I cordially esteem as a good citizen and a good American. The outburst of feeling in the South about it is to me literally inexplicable. I would not lose my self-respect by fearing to have a man like Booker T. Washington to dinner if it cost me every political friend I have got. To Philip Stewart, his table mate at the dinner, TR commented, it never entered my head that any human being would so much comment upon it, for it seemed entirely obvious and natural to show Booker Washington a little ordinary courtesy, as I was consulting and advising with him on public policies of real importance. To another supporter, TR expressed astonishment at the furor. I never thought one way or the other about it, so far as outside effect was concerned, and simply asked Booker Washington to dinner because he is one of the most distinguished and, without exception, the most useful of the men of the South, and I wanted to talk over with him certain matters. To Curtis Guild, he proclaimed simply, I shall have him to dine just as often as I please. But over time, some of TR's remarks reflected a reassessment. In a 1906 letter to his friend, the novelist Owen Wister, TR admitted that, quote, I am not satisfied that I acted wisely in either the Booker Washington dinner or the Crumb appointment, though each was absolutely justified from every proper standpoint, save that of expediency. Postmaster General George Meyer recorded in his diary that TR made a similar remark at a cabinet meeting in February 1909. Quote, and this is from Meyer's diary, the president, in speaking of his actions while in office, mentioned the inviting of Booker Washington to a meal at the White House was a mistake on his part. Not the action itself, but the effect on the South was injurious and misinterpreted. While TR still felt he had still been right in morally and socially to dine with an African American of Booker T. Washington's standing, he recognized after the fact that the ramifications of his action may not have been worth following his instincts in human decency. Some of TR's friends and associates also tried to walk back the significance of the meal, perhaps to do some damage control on TR's behalf. Instead of dinner, they claimed it had been a lunch meeting, or maybe even an impromptu sandwich on a tray, which gave the incident a sense of innocent spontaneity rather than the deliberate action of issuing a dinner invitation. Arguing for the meal having been lunch rather than dinner also took Edith Roosevelt out of the equation, as she would have had no reason to join her husband's lunchtime business meeting. In this rendition, white womanhood remains segregated and pure, countering the sexual innuendo of the Southern response to the mixed gathering at the dinner table. As some predicted, this tempest in a teapot, as many referred to it at the time, soon ran its course in the press. And of course, the hoopla surrounding the dinner represented only one of a myriad of issues the new president needed to address. Over the remainder of TR's presidency and their respective lives, TR and Booker T. Washington continued to be in contact. TR's desk diaries record several visits by Booker T. Washington to the White House, but all of them during business hours. The private dinner arrangement, however, was never repeated. In October 1905, TR made his long-deferred visit to Tuskegee, and the two men continued to correspond about political appointments. After Booker T. Washington's death in 1915, Theodore Roosevelt wrote the preface to the 1916 book, Booker T. Washington, Builder of a Civilization. Although much of TR's laudatory text reflects the opinions of a white man writing in the environment of race relations in 1916, his concluding words ring true to his feelings about the relationship. I profited very much by my association with Booker T. Washington, TR wrote. I owed him much along many different lines. I valued greatly his friendship and respect, and when he died, I mourned his loss as a patriot and an American. So if the famous October 16th, 1901 dinner was something of a tempest and a teapot at the time, then we have to ask ourselves, why does this event even matter? Well, one immediate impact of the dinner was on Theodore Roosevelt's relationship with the South. TR's mother had been born in Georgia, and his family connections to the South initially boded well for TR to make at least some inroads there. But the dinner incident quickly soured many white Southerners on TR for flouting social conventions in dining with an African American at the White House. White Southerners appreciated Booker T. Washington's 1895 promise that in all things purely social we can be as separate as the fingers, but many could not abide it when those fingers held a knife and fork to eat dinner with the president. Many people of the time, including TR and Booker T. Washington, recognized the inconsistency and outright hypocrisy of those same irate white Southerners in their own racial interactions. Washington himself provided an excellent example of the human ability to hold contradictory notions simultaneously. On July 9th, 1903, Washington sent TR a clipping from the Baltimore Herald with the note, "The enclosed is a true story." The story reads, and I'm not going to do the dialect, so you can just read along with me. An old Florida colonel recently met Booker T. Washington and in a bilbious burst of confidence said to the Negro educator, "Sir, I am glad to meet you. Always wanted to shake your hand, sir. I think, sir, you are the greatest man in America." "Oh, no," said Mr. Washington. "You are, sir," said the colonel, and then pugnaciously, "Who's greater?" "Well," said the founder of Tuskegee, "there's President Roosevelt." "No, sir," roared the colonel, "not by a jugful. I used to think so, but since he invited you to dinner, I think he's a blank scoundrel." The journalist Ray Stannard Baker happened to be at Sagamore Hill for lunch when TR, quote, read this clipping with the greatest gusto. And Baker recorded in his notebook that TR laughed uproariously at the absurdity of the punchline. TR replied to Washington that, quote, "I think that is one of the most delightful things I have ever read. It is almost too good to believe. What a splendid confusion of ideas it does show." However, the dinner provided an excellent opportunity for white Southern Democrats to diffuse a possible challenge to their political dominance in the region. TR was a Republican and one with an eye to gaining support in the South by appointing to patronage positions individuals he felt worthy because of their character and their willingness to be fair in their dealings, whether they be Republicans, African Americans, or cooperative Democrats. For entrenched Democratic leaders in the South, TR's agenda potentially threatened their established power structure. But the 1901 dinner gave them a rallying point early in TR's administration, the reliable dog whistle of race. As historian H.W. Brands noted, quote, "Experience had shown that it was far more effective to cry N-word than Republican." A Georgia man confirmed as much to TR in 1901. Quote, "Negro domination is the scarecrow that is continually held up to our people, and opposition to it is the only excuse that the Democratic Party now offers for existence. Despite the public furor over the dinner subsiding within a few weeks of the event, opposition forces would reintroduce it in subsequent election cycles to remind voters of TR's 1901 dalliance with racial equality. Late in the presidential campaign of 1904, TR complained of a speech given by Congressman James Heflin of Alabama, quote, in which he deliberately incites murder, using the expression that if some shogosh had thrown a bomb under the table at which I sat with Booker Washington, no great harm would have been done the country. In some locales, Democratic committees distributed campaign buttons depicting the dinner and the word equality, hoping to damage Republican election chances. This certainly wasn't the first, nor would it be the last time that a cultural issue was used for political advancement. And TR long remembered the political fallout he experienced by crossing the racial line, which likely influenced his actions or inactions in future situations involving race relations. Still, one wonders what further inroads in the Democratic white South TR would have realistically achieved had the dinner not occurred at all. Humorist Finley Peter Dunn addressed this point through his Mr. Dooley character in a piece on the Booker T. Washington dinner. And again, I especially won't try to attempt Mr. Dooley's thick Irish brogue, but again, you can read it along on the screen. Says Mr. Dooley of the incident, it's going to be the ruination of President Teddy's chances in the South. Thousands of men who wouldn't have voted for him under any circumstances have declared that under no circumstances would they now vote for him. The fallout of the 1901 dinner also allows us to consider Theodore Roosevelt's own complicated relationships with matters of race and ethnicity. TR's correspondence and writings make it abundantly clear that he considered whites to be the superior race. He certainly was not alone in that perspective in the early 1900s. But expressed at a time when Americans were grappling with waves of immigrants from all over the globe, his derogatory comments on racial and ethnic groups are uncomfortable to modern eyes. But at the same time, TR could appreciate individuals from almost any background who excelled, made something of themselves, or exhibited what he considered worthy characteristics. And when it came to Booker T. Washington, TR wrote of him and his accomplishments with respect and admiration, even after their dinner, on balance, proved to be an unintended political liability for him. In thanking Washington for his kind words in a 1911 article, TR commented, quote, for ordinary applause and ordinary blame, I do not care a rap either way, but I do value the good opinion of the best citizens, and therefore I value yours. Another ramification of the 1901 dinner was its impact on Booker T. Washington's already significant prestige. On one hand, the dinner drove his communications with Roosevelt into the shadows of occasional meetings and private correspondence that largely stayed out of public view. However, to accomplish as much as he did, the pragmatic Washington often had to exert influence secretly and through private channels. While Washington was just one of many advisors on whom TR relied during his presidency, and TR did not always follow his counsel, Booker T. Washington was a powerful influence behind the scenes. The public furor over the 1901 dinner brought this relationship to the foreground and made it known that the president sought the principal's guidance. Thus, Booker T. Washington became a man with far more political influence than ever before, even when he claimed to operate outside of the political arena. In the wake of the 1901 dinner, he certainly received letters requesting his assistance with access to the president, or along the lines of, now that I know that you have the president's ear, can you do this for me? Thus, even if Washington's relationship with TR after the dinner was conducted largely out of public view, the public, especially African Americans, now knew that Booker T. Washington was a political player early in the Roosevelt administration, and that made him a force to be reckoned with. Booker T. Washington's significance during Theodore Roosevelt's administration was highlighted in at least two interesting visual representations, anticipating the end of TR's term in 1909. On March 1, 1909, TR's military aide, Archie Budd, wrote to his sister-in-law Clara about a decorative tableau complimenting a tea held at the James R. Garfield's home for members of TR's famous tennis cabinet. The center of the table was made into a tennis court with nets, sand, and players, Archie began his letter. The players were 4 teddy bears, each dressed in sweaters, to represent the players seen most often on the White House court. Then began a panoramic review of his most notable acts during his administration. Beginning was a teddy bear and a little black Negro sitting at a table together, being a takeoff of the Booker Washington incident, unquote. That the 1901 dinner was included with representations of the Panama Canal, the Portsmouth Peace Treaty, and a big stick having conquered Congress suggests that the dinner remained a memorable event of the Roosevelt administration. Likewise, in February 1908, Puck magazine ran a centerfold cartoon titled Roosevelt's Farewell to His Officers, a parody of the Alonzo Chapel painting of George Washington's 1783 farewell to his officers in the Continental Army. The cartoon caption predicts repetition 1 year hence of a famous scene in Francis Tavern. TR remained stoic as the officers around him all shed tears at their parting. Including in the illustration are TR's assorted subordinates and friends, William Howard Taft, Jacob Riis, William Loeb, James R. Garfield, and John Burroughs, among others. But just outside the doorway and slightly apart from the main group is Booker T. Washington. He too is overcome with grief, as well he might have been in reality. TR's successor, William Howard Taft, made initial overtures to Washington, which Washington hoped was suggestive of a continuing relationship between Tuskegee and the White House. As in so many other ways, though, Taft was not TR, and Booker T. Washington's influence during the Taft administration never ever approached the levels Washington had enjoyed with TR. Whether intentionally or not, the Puck artist captured something central about the relationship of Booker T. Washington and Theodore Roosevelt. The 1901 dinner alerted the world that Roosevelt considered Washington an advisor whose opinions he sought and respected, and a man whose race did not preclude him from being invited to the White House for dinner. He belonged in the illustration as one of TR's officers. But after the furor died down, Washington exerted his influence more in the shadows, through correspondence and other less public means of communication. As the only African American depicted in the group, Washington remained just outside the door rather than being with the white officers in the room where it happened. The famous October 16, 1901 dinner of Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington brought out both the best and the worst in people's reactions with regard to race relations. It gave hope to some African Americans that they had advocates in the White House, and appalled some white Americans for the exact same reason. It was a public tempest in a teapot, soon replaced in the headlines by other news, and it was an event that influenced aspects of the Roosevelt administration well into the future. And for these reasons and more, it is still worth reading the tea leaves that the Tempest left behind.